Welcome into the Vertical Pursuit podcast and webcast. We are available on Spotify, iTunes, on the Vertical Pursuit app, also on YouTube. And you can check us out on the website, verticalpursuit.org. Mike Barrett, Mike Tatlock. You know, before we get into today's topic, were the ribs good last night?
I wanted to bring it up. So it's so funny you said this because you guys got to know listening on this. Mike is a grill master. And I know you're too humble to even admit this though, but I get a lot of, I'm like his Padawan. I'm like his young Jedi Knight looking and aspiring, but those were absolutely amazing. Yes.
Okay.
Well, absolutely amazing.
Nick Livingston, who's working here.
That's right.
Nick and David, they're both grillers. Colton Myers, he's a fledgling grill master. We're going to work on him. But here's the funny thing.
Wait, real quick. A big shout out because Colton is getting married next weekend.
Oh man.
So I just want to do a huge shout out to that.
VP live at the ceremony. Are you doing the wedding?
Uh-huh.
Attaboy. I knew you would.
Yeah.
But it was kind of funny because I was thinking, and probably this is because I've listened to you and your sermons for years. And and you've done this, by the way, where I was actually kind of thinking about what I was last night while I'm figuring out what I was going to grill. I was going to almost tie it into something, because you can do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
The funny part about this is, and Nick gets some credit here because I've done every rib recipe I've done ribs a million times. And we've found, and Nick would attest to this, that the simpler we got with the recipe and the process, the better they're getting.
Yeah.
So I think people overthink the ribs. And ribs and brisket, I know, are kind of the thing. Brisket's the big thing that everybody does. And, briskets take so long. I do once in a while, but so I've got it down to, so here's your recipe.
Oh, this is huge.
Boys
You're giving
and
your
girls.
secrets out?
Yeah, it's not a secret.
Oh.
And you're really going to know it's not when I tell you what it is. But so I used to, we went, Chad Ward's a big pit master, and we did the Traeger school, Nick and I did, this is years ago. And then Traeger has the 3-2-1, they have all these different recipes. And then Chad has one where you do the ribs for 2 hours and you do like honey, brown sugar, and butter, and you turn them face down. You wrap them in foil, put them back on for one, take them back off, sauce them. And that's great. That works great. And I printed that one out and I've sent it to a bunch of guys. But what we've kind of figured out now is 3 hours, 300 degrees.
That's it.
And
Nothing in between.
No.
No injections.
That's what
no
you had
foil
last
wrap.
night.
That's it.
No injection, no wrap, nothing. And if you can ride that temp at 300, at 3 hours, you are golden.
And I'll tell you what, and I'm not just saying this, those were tender, but here's the thing is I don't like to grab a rib. Now, this is my own preference. I don't like to grab a rib and it just breaks down in your hand.
You don't want to fall off the bone is kind of a cliche, but it's not necessarily good. It's
not. And those were a perfect combination of when you bite into it, you actually are biting into something. It doesn't feel like pudding.
Yeah.
When it's too soft, it was, but yet at the same time, it was full of flavor and juicy. And like, I thought they were done perfectly well. The sauce you had on it. And what rub are you using on those, by the way?
That was a rib rub, kind of a combination. I use a lot of Meat Church stuff.
Yeah, well, of course, shout out to Meat Church.
Yeah, shout out to Matt and Meat Church. But yes, that, and by the way, we should have Matt on one of these days. He's down in Texas, but and have him to tell you where the name Meat Church came from. So anyway, I'll tease with that. Nick got to know Matt when he was down shooting some videos in Texas. But yeah, very, very cool. And I give Nick some credit for that because I had to trust him on that. I'm like, yeah, but what about all the wrap and this and all the ingredients? And nope, just go simple and it works.
That might be, I think that's a parable.
It is a parable. I was trying to say that earlier. I was going to use it in something, but
it is.
Just get back to the basics. And that was kind of what I was doing. You're good about taking stories and turning them into parables and how they relate. But that's when I was thinking last night while I was doing them, I should bring this up on Vertical Pursuit because there is a lesson there too.
There is.
Because I think a lot of people in the barbecue world, they they think they have to do too much.
Yeah.
You really don't.
No, honestly, that's the best, one of the best analogies for our faith. I think people, you go on YouTube and you watch somebody on there and they've got this 50-step process and then they got 1 million followers and you're like, oh my gosh, I guess I got to figure that out. Right. So you mortgage the house, you go get all the equipment, you set up your shop and you're like, And how many times have you and I been to even nice restaurants? And by nice, I mean, like an established restaurant. I'm like, those are okay. And I've had the ones that you made, I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's better than most of the restaurants that I go to. And so and your simplicity, I think that's the same thing of having a simple faith, not a complex, overcomplicated. In fact, Jesus even said, I've come, and he said, not to put an even greater burden on you. Mm-hmm. He says, my burden's light, my yoke is light, not a heavy one. And he was contrasting that to the religious leaders who had created on top of the laws.
There's the parable.
There's the parable. There we go. They had created so many, not God's laws, their laws. They just added them up more and more and more and more. And then they'd live by that. And that was the burden. He said, that's the yoke of slavery. He goes, I didn't come for that, to put that on you.
Yeah.
So there's the parable.
Yeah. And I love that. And I explain that to people at times. And I think I mentioned this in episode 11, but when people will say, if you throw out something that sounds like it's Christian, oh, you're religious. I always say, no, not at all. And then I'll say, but I follow Jesus, and then if that kicks off the discussion, it usually comes back to, now explain the difference in that. And maybe I have this wrong, but I always felt like, when, and especially it's like in the Chosen series that we watch, and then you read the New Testament, Jesus ticked off all the religious guys.
Yeah, totally.
And that was the part where he was trying to show them that all that stuff, all those ingredients, all that foil, all that stuff, that's not necessary.
Yep, exactly.
This is the way. And he'd get invited to dinner, didn't wash his hands right. They get mad, and he knew what he was doing.
Yep.
And I love that. But that there is the parable in that, certainly. Now, the other part of this that does tie into more of what I wanted to talk about today was Traeger has this whole thing about lifting the lid.
Yep.
Don't lift and peek. Don't lift and peek. And that is my whole life, is the lift, peek, worry, kind of fret, the anxiety of what's it looking like in there, and and I didn't mean that to be a parable as well, but I guess it kind of works, because that is the worry of today. And the more that I was talking to a guy the other day, and I said something about, he was asking me about the podcast. It might even have been a guy after you kind of introduced it at church. He said, well, I wouldn't know about it because I'm not on social media. And he said, I got off it. I was just too angry a person when I was on it. And I just said, good for you.
Yeah.
I mean, because we've talked about this before. I'm guilty too of getting my news feed on Twitter. Nick and I have talked about that, getting your news feed on Twitter. And that's designed to do one thing. Engagement is the biggest reason that you hear such extremes, and you end up angry, and I think you end up worried and anxious about things you don't need to be worried and anxious about. And I'm not the best at that because I'm a worrier. My mom would tell you, and she was a worrier, and I do. And I've said to you before, there's days you wake up, and if it's an otherwise peaceful, light day, you create things to worry about because it doesn't feel right if you're not.
Yeah.
That's a part, I hate that. And it's not a curse, it's just a weakness. And I'm trying to get that fixed. But it also helps too. And a friend told me this the other day, we were doing a devotional. It helps me when I consider that the Bible teaches and tells us, consider worry as a sin.
Yeah.
So if you are worried or if you're worrying, you're sinning.
Yeah.
I want you to tell me what that means.
That's good.
Because it sounds, and I think a good way, worry is a sinful expression of fear.
That's it.
And I love the way that's stated, because then that helps me to know you're not helping yourself in this. You're actually sinning. You're going against what Jesus would want from you. And you're not setting a very good example for your kids, which I don't, because they know that I'm kind of a worrier. And I hate that. And I want to be released from that bondage of worry.
That's a good way to say it.
So how do you do that? The destruction of worry.
And I think that's it. Every guy that's listening, every woman that's listening right now, everybody struggles at some level. There's a scale of peace and then worry and anxiety. And everybody's somewhere along that line, some more than others. And it can be debilitating. I mean, honestly, I know anxiety has been a part of our family and working through that, and friends. And as an NBA chaplain, it's interesting you bring this up because the NBA head office, we don't hear from them often, but when we do, it's important. They showed up at a conference, and by conference I mean we get together as NBA chaplains once a year. We go to Grand Rapids. We encourage each other. The NBA head office sent someone to our conference, so you got probably 30 of us chaplains in a room, and they said, "Hey, we need your help as chaplains.
Wow.
What you guys bring to the table is a solution." And we're going, wait, what are we hearing right now? Like,
we thought we were going to get tossed out.
Exactly.
Canceled.
Yeah, exactly. Like, are we getting canceled, right?
Yeah.
And they said, listen, the number one thing that we're struggling with athletes, not from an athletic standpoint, although this directly and indirectly implies that it can affect their performance, was anxiety.
Yeah.
And more athletes are coming forward, which is great because I think as an athlete comes forward, it gives permission for all these guys, men and women, to say, oh, I struggle with this. Because the thing is this, anxiety and fear, the more you try to resolve that by yourself internally, it gets amplified. Mm-hmm. And so you got to talk like you're doing right now. What we're doing is you're saying, hey, I struggle with this. We all do. By bringing the conversation up, we're inviting everybody that's listening to be honest with themselves. That's a starting point. Do you wrestle with this? We know you do. Now we got to talk about it. And it's funny how you bring up that fear is tied to sin. And a lot of people hear that and go, oh, great. So now I'm feeling like I was already feeling bad about myself. And now you say it's a sin. I must be this horrible person.
Now you're sinning too. So
right, exactly.
Let's throw another log
Just
on the fire.
throw one more log on that, the shame fire, right? Like, But what's interesting is you have to understand the word sin. So we'll start with that. Sin comes from this Greek word, hamartia. And it's this where we get this idea. It means missing the mark. So imagine someone that's an archer and there's a target and they draw the arrow back in the bow and they let it fly. We all know it's intended is to hit the bullseye. The bullseye is peace. And the bullseye even has a name. His name's Jesus. Jesus said, I am peace. He's the Prince of Peace. So in Jesus is ultimate peace. He's the bullseye. So when we talk about sin, we're talking about missing the mark. And so when we talk about fear and anxiety, it's missing the mark of the peace that we are created to experience in Jesus. He's the solution to that. So when Jesus comes to take away sin, it's not that he's just trying to clean up our behavior. He's saying, listen, I've come to be the solution to everything you struggle with. And I've come to eradicate the damage and destruction, as you said, of sin. And one of the results of missing the mark, sin, is that we get overwhelmed with anxiety and fear. But it's everybody wrestles with that. I mean, Jesus talked about it when he showed up, 2,000 years ago. He said, hey, don't worry. He said that so many times. And he said, why are you so fearful? And so we have to kind of unpack the anatomy of fear. Today, though, I mean, Jesus talked about fear and anxiety and worry 2,000 years ago. I think it's perhaps maybe even worse today because of us living in a tech world, information age. And honestly, you said it earlier, though. I think this is how sick our world is, too, from an economic standpoint, a capitalistic standpoint. There are companies, businesses, social media, and media that are capitalizing on fear.
Sure.
They know if they can drive fear, it feeds that. And so that you get viewers, and viewers ends up being money. And so I call it fear porn. There's a lot of fear porn out there that's being produced, and they're capitalizing on that. And they're taking advantage of people's fears and anxieties, but they stir it up, and it's marketable.
And you get addicted to it.
Yeah.
You really do. And you want to be fed that. Mm-hmm. I find that
totally.
When I'm on social media, where I haven't checked Twitter in a while or whatever it is, I want to come see it just in case and then I get wound up or I get fearful, and then I put it down and think, I would have been so much better off. I didn't need to know that stuff. I didn't need to worry about that stuff. And then understand, again, the basic point of it is you read and engage with that, and then it's going to feed you 15 more because it went, okay, we got him for a while. Right. We got him for, The Social Dilemma, which was on Netflix.
Exactly.
It's phenomenal the way they talk about it. And it's scary because just about every guy who was involved in creating the whole algorithm said it ends in civil war. Now, I don't honestly think it'll end there, but I can see where if you get stuck into that, and I told my son this the other day when he was talking about people and he was talking about reactions, and I said to him, I don't I don't fear individual people. I fear groups of people, especially when they're allowed to remain anonymous or on social media. And part of that, I think, and we discussed this a little bit in episode 11, I don't think it's as bad as you take somebody who isn't on social media all the time and you look at the peace that they have to some degree more than I have, and their worry is less. And I think in reality, the case is less. I mean, I know there are certain topics and big topics that come up and big news events that are worthy of our attention. 90% of it isn't.
Right.
And I think it just feeds. And then I think, how weird is it and how kind of sick is it that we're wired in such a way to where we kind of like it, we kind of need it.
Yeah.
And like I was saying earlier, if there's a day that comes up and I'm not stressed or worried about something, or it's going to be an otherwise fairly peaceful day, I try to find something.
Yeah.
And I think, what are you doing?
Yep.
And it's something that I'm very aware of. And I know that I'm really not alone in this. A lot of people, especially these days, are in that. And then when you have something that comes out like a Supreme Court ruling, and then you go on Instagram or something and you see all of these just fire bombs back and forth between some people that you know, and I don't want to take any part of that, because I don't want to have to worry about my response and I don't think my thoughts are worthy of anybody having to, they're not profound enough to put out there. Who cares?
Right.
But in terms of what we can talk about is hopefully giving tools to people like me, who you have that innate problem, if you would, or curse of worry and anxiety, and then putting it, as you just did, back to, because the funny thing is I was looking around this morning, and I've told people this too, it's no different now. It's same as it ever was. And people talk about God and Jesus in the same way, same today, same yesterday, same tomorrow. Worry was mentioned all over the Bible.
All over.
And these are people who have really simple lives for the most part, the way we would compare it to today. Now, granted, they were having to worry about, here's the term, but what they're going to eat, what they're going to do for money.
And Jesus addressed all of that.
Yeah,
He's like, don't worry about tomorrow, for today has enough worries of its own. And he's like, don't worry about where you're going to sleep. Don't worry. But sometimes you hear Jesus say that and you're like, okay, but how do you turn that off? How do you, especially, honestly, and some of it comes out of love. I mean, I think for us, both as parents, but speaking, you and me as dads, man, we worry over our kids because we love them. And so it's not so much that I'm worried for myself. Sometimes I worry about my family. I'm worried about their welfare. And so how do you balance out concern? I think that's a healthier way we say it. Like, how do you have a healthy concern for things? Like, there's good fears, right? I mean, everybody knows you got a kid, you're like, don't touch the stove. And you try to protect them from that. And at some point, they have to develop a healthy fear of something that's dangerous. And that's a good kind of fear that makes us responsible, makes us discerning, makes us wise. But then there's the unhealthy side of fear, which is dysfunctional. And that's it's funny you bring up the whole social media again, too, because I heard it explained this way. Why is anxiety going through the roof right now more than ever in, at least in our era of life, the last 40, 50 years? Because we've had access to more information. Yeah. It used to be,
that's what I mean.
I was fearful about the knowledge I had around me.
Yeah.
So and before the information age, because of technology, I didn't have access to tons of stuff. I mean, you'd have newspapers or radio programs and there was TV, but not to the extent now where it's instant, it's live feeds constantly. And you know what's going on with all the problems around the world, not just what's in your circle. And one person explained it to me this way. I thought this was so good, is that when you look at God, one of the attributes of God is he's omniscient, which means all-knowing. God knows everything. We weren't designed to know everything.
That's true.
And God can handle the burden of knowledge. And I think sometimes right now, knowledge is both a blessing. It's also a burden. And so we're not wired to be able to absorb at any given time all the problems of the world. Yeah. It just feeds into that burden of fear. And then we're constantly like, what's happening? Well, this is happening, this is happening. And it's almost addictive. And you come back to it and you come back to it. Yeah. And we feed on that and we feed that fear. And when that fear is going to take over at some point.
And it's funny, you look back at even when I grew up, and that was, early days in the 70s and then the 80s, but I think of my kids now and all the worries I have for them, as you said. My son is driving, my daughter's about to drive, and so they come home, pretty good. We set a curfew. We're not ultra strict, but on that kind of stuff we are. But I don't tend to. But my point is, I have an app that tells me where he is, how fast he is going, if he's gotten to his destination safely.
Yeah.
And then there's even a button on there that you can turn on if they have a crash.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I want to know that, obviously.
Yeah.
But then I look back at my childhood and even in high school and growing up in a smaller town. And we were told when to be home, but what we did between then, they had no idea.
No.
And we were good kids. But my goodness. And maybe it's because of that makes me more worried about my kids.
Yeah.
But I worry about their worry.
Yeah.
Of knowing, and I like the accountability, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I think the accountability is great. There's lots of safety reasons that we need to know where our kids are. But I'm wondering what the result of this is going to be for them when they're older, because I had a couple times when I took off in the car and, and when I was a kid and out way too late, and then you're driving home and you meet dad on the highway who's out checking the ditches to see if you crashed, and not happy, which had happened a few times, but that didn't back up on me. But if I had the I don't want to say the burden, but I know my kids know we love them and we know that they know we're doing it for the right reason. Do you think it's going to create in these kids someday more paranoia, more anxiety, and more worry, given the accessibility to them, their car, whatever they're doing, every move they make? Because I'm not sure how healthy that is.
It's not. And I think it's a generational thing. And I think that, you and I, we talked about it. You just said a few seconds ago, when we were kids, I remember the days when, it's like you jump on your Hot Wheel, you're like, in the sixth grade, and you were driving your Hot Wheel down to the 7-Eleven that was 5 miles away, and you'd come back when the street lights were down. Like that was, you were kicking the can, you're running around, and now it's the helicopter parenting approach where it's like we hover. And I do believe they say that anxiety is something that is environmental. And so if you are an anxious person, you actually can pass on your anxiety.
Sure.
And there's a phrase right now, there's a book actually by a pastor, Mark Sayers. He wrote a book called Non-Anxious Presence. How do you have a non-anxious presence? Jesus had a non-anxious presence. One of the best stories, Jesus in the boat, and he's with the disciples, and the storm's kicking up. They're freaking out. They're tripping. And where's Jesus? He's napping. And he's having a non-anxious presence. And
I always wonder if he was really napping. Or
one eye open.
One eye open, kind of going, watch these guys, and teaching him a lesson.
Probably both.
But the visual and the reading the idea that he's sleeping amid the storm that's dumping waves over the boat.
Absolutely.
It was such a good example to these guys, again, to us now.
Yeah. So I think we have a parental responsibility that is contributing to, and we're passing on, and that's just going to culminate more and more. And you got kids growing up where that's the oxygen they're breathing in the house is anxiety and worry, and so they become a byproduct of that. I think the other thing that nobody's talking about right now, and I'll just give me like 60 seconds on this, but I think culturally, our culture is feeding it because there's agendas at play. When I was in Rwanda several times, but people don't know this, but the story of Rwanda, they had a genocide, massive slaughter, and two tribes that lived harmoniously. I mean, it'd be like, if you had somebody from Idaho and Montana, you're from a different state, but we're great together, right? There was no animosity at all. And so you go, well, wait a minute. How did they go from a place of total unity and being harmonious together to one day, one neighbor grabs a machete and completely goes to town on his neighbor and just murders him. I mean, chops him up. And I'm saying that graphically so people actually understand how bad it was. What's that?
It's Uganda and Rwanda?
Yeah, Rwanda, yeah. And it's happened in other places. And so as we've spent time there, and I know the history, it was a fade. Nobody went from, hey, we're unified and we're harmonious, into the point where one group's murdering another group. But here's what I want to say in that. Where does fear come into that? They had to pit one group over the other. And fear was the weapon. And that's the definition of terrorism.
Yeah.
That is the definition. Fear is a weapon, which is what Satan uses. Jesus said, I've come that you may have life to the full. part of having life to the full is a peaceful life. Satan wants to destroy us, and I think that he weaponizes fear. And we're living in a culture right now, and Marxism was a big part of this. Marxists believed that you had to get people to destroy each other because that was their strategy to achieve some utopia, was tear it all down, burn it all down, and rebuild over and over again, and then someday, eventually, you'll reach that. Well, that mindset, put whatever label you want on that, exists today, where if we can demonize the other person, and you do that by creating fear of them.
And that's why propaganda is
That's
so important.
exactly. It's funny you mentioned the word propaganda, because I wrote in my notes, a journal, God's promises cancel the propaganda of fear. And so when we live under God's promises, I want to feed that. I don't want to feed on the propaganda of fear that turns me into this person that's like, I got to watch out every person that's over there. And you saw this happen with COVID.
Yeah.
And the messaging of COVID was so destructive. Honestly, I think the messaging of COVID was way more destructive than actual COVID itself, because it caused people to turn on each other and said, oh, you know what? Fear them. Watch out for that person. And there was so much weaponizing of fear that happens in the political realm. You know, how do we use fear to get you to fear the other person by demonizing them? And it's kind of a part of our culture. So when you ask the question, how do we help our kids? We got to check ourselves, make sure we're not passing that on. We also have to help them grow up understanding, like, let's not buy into what culture is doing right now, and buy into the propaganda, the fear porn, the capitalizing on fear.
And simplify.
And
just
simplify.
like the rib recipe.
It's just like coming back to the parable. Exactly.
We appreciate you always for listening, and we hope that some of the things we say give you some tools, or at least get some conversations started, not only among you and your friends, but hopefully your family as well. And we appreciate everybody involved in Vertical Pursuit. Nick Livingston, back pushing buttons, David Ward, Colton Myers. You guys are great for doing this, and we appreciate everybody for listening and watching, and we will see you next time on Vertical Pursuit. We invite you to subscribe to our podcast, comment, or message us, and check out our website at verticalpursuit.org. Download the VP app and check us out on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.